So let's dive right in. This is a Patreon exclusive, but you're more than welcome to share it around if you'd like. The reason I'm not going to put it on the main channel is just because there's some development issues that I haven't quite figured out yet, and I don't like to put unfinished things into the main teaching body. But basically, we're going to look at the breakdown of how I made this little procedural carbon nanotube that you may have seen floating around on Twitter with a little help from Brady Johnston. I will be releasing a proper tutorial of this, but the main reason I'm not doing it right now is because of this right here. So this is the 3.1 beta version of Blender, and while these nodes will all be part of the main package when everything levels up, I don't like to put out tutorials that make use of some of the more experimental tools, and unfortunately, this particular version relies quite heavily on a specific set of nodes unique to 3.1 and onwards. Now, some of you may recall that in the past, I've actually made assets for, where are we? I've made assets for a number of the things that Geometry Nodes is going to make a little bit more straightforward. So if I can actually find it in here somewhere, let's just organize my name. There it is. Boron nitride and carbon nanotubes. And this is sort of a legacy or heritage approach to this. So this is a specific object. It has a deform so that it will actually twist in the right way. It has an array modifier so that if you wanted to enable it, you could add any number of lengths that you'd like. It has a particle system for the carbon atoms, wireframes, bevels, all this kind of great stuff. And you could map it along a curve to get it to follow or something like that. I'm not going to remove these assets, and I'm not going to replace them either, because the simple reality is these are fully backwards compatible, whereas some of the new Geometry Nodes approaches are not. And I think that it's worth kind of separating them out into two different camps. But let's just go dive into a new scene. In fact, let's go back for starters to the procedural Geometry Nodes and sort of look at why these are worthwhile. So if I were to grab this, and I'll just duplicate it with Shift-D, that's one of the other reasons why I don't do experimental work in newer builds, is because for whatever reason, screencast keys do not often play along. So you'd see if I enable them, nice little error message, it's just not going to work. But the key thing is that you can see these are all Bezier curves. And so if I grab this curve, select everything, and then delete it in edit mode, I can come to this little draw feature, and I can just drag more or less anything I want arbitrarily. And that's given me this nice carbon nanotube. Now, 3D being what it is, it's below my ground plane, not to bring it up, all that kind of stuff. But you really get all kinds of fun control here, and the use of curves also adds in a lot of nice little features. So there's an option to animate along the length to switch out the atoms with a selection. There's changing the size of one atom, and then there's changing the size of the other atom. All kinds of fun little things like that. Bond size, similarly. And it really is as simple as just starting to draw new curves. And you can see how this just makes figures kind of a lot easier in some ways. If you were doing a cover and you just want some background elements of carbon nanotubes, then fantastic. And the other thing is this is getting a little heavy. 1.3 million verts is nothing to sniff at, but a lot of this is instance geometry as well. So it's not as heavy on the scene as it would be, certainly if you were using the legacy work. Now, realistically, do I think it's worth putting something like this as an element that you're going to see from this distance? Not particularly. That's kind of silly. I think it's better to use these a little bit closer up and to really sort of take advantage of being able to visualize the structure and adjust it. So if we jump over to the nodes, you can see it's a bit of a tangled mess, but we'll go through kind of what the basics are, and then we'll actually build it roughly from scratch. And so the simple idea is we're going to take in the actual geometry, because this is a curve. We'll take in whatever curve we get, resample it to a certain length that is going to effectively define how close our individual hexagons are. We'll set the curve tilt, and that's going to be important for adjusting the orientation of the hexagons, if you like. And then this trim curve node here lets us actually just build or detract from the node or from the tube on either side. So you can see I'm actually taking away from one end, and I can also take away from the start. And so I used this quite recently to make an animation of a tube growing in an arc furnace. Then we convert this entire curve into a mesh, and we use a circle. So essentially we're just creating a cylinder with a certain resolution of bricks, if you want. We triangulate that, and then we use this dual mesh node, and that converts it to give us these hexagons. And this approach here is actually very similar to what I was doing in the older version of Blender. So many of those tutorials still stand up in some way because it's just now putting those in nodes and having all the work done for you. The wiggle noise is a nice little feature here that I borrowed from Brady Johnston, where you can just essentially create a procedural noise to set positions on all the verts, and then using the frame that the animation is on and just remapping it to a different value, you can take that noise and then essentially distort the whole tube and have it kind of wiggle. The noise is fun, but it can be a little bit overbearing at times. Coming back to the nodes from here, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So if I really wanted this to be simple, all I would have to do is take whatever comes out of here, pump it straight into a thing to make the bonds. So again, meshed curve with a cylinder, and this is just going to create the bonds. That's the radius of the bond. Curved mesh, set the material on it. Atom, same idea. Really where the bulk of all this comes in, I won't cover it here, at least I won't recreate it here, but I'll cover it in the final tutorial, is all of the selection for making the specific instances what you want. So one blue and one orange. And originally I had been under the impression that when Blender was actually creating this, that I was going to be doing something very simple, grabbing the index at every point, taking the modulo of that and the remainder of 2, because I thought every other point would be, even, odd, and it would just be a nice, convenient tool. In reality, that's not the case. And what I'm actually grabbing is the maximum value of the index plus 1. So instead of starting at 0, it starts at 1. And then dividing that number by this little toggle here, which is an animation control. And by doing that, then if I floor that, I can basically say any value that's kind of over this threshold, don't use that one. And then this little not node in here means that one of these selections is not using what comes out here, and the other selection is. And so set the 2 materials, add UV spheres. Technically, because these are the same sphere, I could just do that, but then this radius is different. That's just me rambling a bit. Another group input, and then it all outputs into a joint geometry shade smooth. And from here, you just have nice, simple carbon nanotubes. So we'll go ahead and we'll actually just start breaking that down from scratch, essentially. I'm going to delete the default cube, and I will add in a Bezier curve. We'll come to geometry nodes, add in a new node, and we're pretty much going to do exactly what I just said. So if you wanted to skip ahead to see some of the commentary we're going to do later, now's the time to do it. We'll grab a resample curve, go to length, but this is a good chance to kind of look at what everything's doing. You can kind of see that I've got a number of control points here. So if I change the length, control points will increase or decrease. This is a toggle that you really want to be careful with. If you slide this down one way too far and you're instancing a ton of geometry on it, Blender will have an absolute fit and will almost invariably crash. But from here, we're going to curve resample, and I'm going to start by adding the cylinders, and then we'll actually add the tilt and all of the other nice little features. But we'll go curve to mesh. We'll grab a curve primitive, circle, pop that in there. And this is obviously way too big a radius, but you can see this is what we have. And the idea here is that I'd like these divisions to essentially be square. So if I were doing this by count, which I could also do, I'd have a little bit more control over this. And to be honest, this is a slightly better way if you don't want to run into that crashing error that I mentioned. But if you have it set to length, that means that you can kind of predefine it. And this is a lot better if I actually want to draw things. If I'm going to have an individual tube and I want to set, a number of hexagons here, then I can do it without having to worry about that. But we'll keep it on length for now. And roughly, I just want these to be square. So we'll go with a slightly lower value. That's going to be great. Now we'll go ahead and we'll grab our triangulate. So triangulate, you'll notice, is a mesh node, not a curve, and we have that. So there's our mesh right here. In fact, that's actually the new feature of Blender 3.1 right there. Or if I drag out, you see that little plus sign, it lets me search for things. So I could do that and it'll connect it for me. That's actually quite nice. And now I'm going to go ahead and do that again and grab the dual mesh node. This is a key one. So a lot of my in fact, my first tutorials worked around this idea of dual mesh, which at the time was a feature of Tissue, an add-on that is kind of no longer supported, but is in some ways. Still great stuff. Alessandro Zamparelli, I believe, and a team developed that. We plug that in and we now have our little hexagons, but you're going to notice a few things are wrong here. For starters, I'm in a solid view just because wireframe is not going to actually do this justice. But you'll notice, some of these are 6-sided, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But some of them are 5-sided. To fix that, I just have to change from shortest diagonal to fixed or fixed alternate. And that'll kind of set them. But the other thing that you're going to notice is that these are really offset from where I want them. So I don't want these points to be here. I want them to be shifted over just a little bit. The original way that I tried to do this was with a twist that actually comes out of Arundel's toolkit. So if I scroll out, I apparently don't have the TK toolkit installed in 3.1, so that's frustrating. But Arundel's toolkit essentially has this twist plus node, and it was working. The only problem is it does a twist relative to the origin. And so I would start by twisting here. I'd set the origin to the back, start by twisting here. But if I wanted anything to go even remotely off the x-axis, then suddenly the twist will apply. Instead of going straight, and just correcting all of the hexagon positions, the whole tube would start to curl up into the Y and Z. So that's not what we want. What we actually want is a way to basically say every point that is here has a radius that is separate from the center of the curve, and I just want to shift along that radius, kind of sliding these points almost. And so I was going to do quite a bit of procedural fussing about to make that happen with some of the appropriate math and possibly spherical coordinates or something annoying like that. And then Brady Johnson, who happened to be working on this at the same time, it's funny how that happens, just reminded me that there's a curve tilt node. So that does exactly what I want. In fact, that is getting the curve tilt. What I want instead is to set the curve tilt right here. And so now you can see that I'm able to adjust this value. And essentially you just kind of do this by eye until it more or less works. So we'll just spin, 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 spin. And this is interesting because before that was working and now it doesn't seem to want to. So this is again one of those moments where why would I develop this and why am I posting this here? Because this is some good insight into how you think you have a process worked down, and then when you actually go to record it in a tutorial, it doesn't play along. So what is going on here and why is this curve tilt not working? I'm pretty sure it's because I actually need to adjust each single point based on its relative location. So what I need to do is use the index. So I'll grab the index of each point, which you can see will essentially be here. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 for every single vert. And I'm going to adjust this tilt based on the index so that instead of everything spinning together the way it is now, it will spin a little bit depending on the value. And so we'll grab a math node, utilities, math, pump that in here, and we'll probably change this to multiply. We'll connect this in, and okay, that's a little bit interesting. And we'll bring that to a low value. There we go. So now all of these are aligned very nicely. And if I want them to be more of a proper hexagon, I just have to bring this length value down. And there we go, almost perfect. Let's go for 0.033. 0.03. There we go. And so again, these are the types of things where I would expose this parameter to the user so that they could adjust the tilt. I would expose this parameter. And if it works nicely, I might not have to do that because it might just actually work for any length. So let's see, we'll just extrude that out. There it goes. And again, no more worrying about array modifiers. It just kind of works. And that's perfect. So we've got our values set up. We could adjust the length to kind of increase the resolution. We could adjust the circle here to kind of adjust the size of the whole thing. And if we do that, then we're going to have to probably adjust in tandem. So my version of this node right now has it set that you can adjust these independently. Brady did a slightly cleverer version that will likely be more akin to what I release as a final product. And what it allows is for you to change this value and this value sort of simultaneously. So it will always look like a proper hexagon. The last kind of part of this is how do we put all of the points and how do we get the wireframe? Well, right now we've got a mesh and we're actually just going to convert that back to a curve. So we'll go ahead and we'll find mesh, mesh to curve, connect that in right there. We'll connect this here instead. And now you can see I've got my wireframe back. We'll do the almost exact same thing where we just grab these two nodes, duplicate them over, and we'll connect these up. Again, way too big, 0.001, let's bring that right down. And now we effectively have our bonds. Now this is not perfect. These cylinders are actually intersecting each other, but we don't really necessarily care about that because if we want to put atoms on those same points, which everything now is going to come from here, we'll grab this, bring it down, and we'll do an instance on points. And all we want is a mesh primitive UV sphere. So UV sphere, good. This is probably going to be too big, so we'll start there. I'll select these two, control, number pad 0 to join. And yeah, those are too big. So let's bring that down by another order of magnitude. Oh, too much. 5. Perfect. There we go. And now we'll just add a set shade smooth. Let's do that. And we'll connect this. So a good shortcut that I picked up from Arendelle is Alt-Shift left-click. That will connect whatever node you have selected right into the geometry output. And there we go. Just like that, we've got this really impressive nanotube generator, and this effectively all works. So when I finally release this, the tutorial will be a lot cleaner. We're at about 15 minutes of recording now. But this will be, I think, maybe 5 minutes for the first initial walkthrough. I won't go into nearly the detail of like what's happening at every step. I might add some of it just because I think that stuff is useful to know and it informs a bit about the process. But we'll do all of this. Probably this will be about 5 minutes. And then after that, I think I will maybe add in a section on the selection. I don't like the tutorials to be too long if I feel they don't have to be. And I think that it might just be worthwhile to say, here's the final set of nodes that you can use if you want and kind of examine them. And they do have this option for making the boron nitride equivalent that you can kind of see. Oh, that's the original asset that you can see in the rough tests. Something like that. And so this is effectively just a nice way to do that. The other thing that I wanted to kind of discuss today is just starting to do more tutorial walkthroughs for actual figures, which I haven't done in a little while, excuse me. But there's plenty of good stuff to do, so let's go ahead and lose the full screen window here. We'll just exit out of that. Nice little background of glassware. I am still working on a Schlenk line. I have to get all the dimensions down. Schlenks are kind of a big target that I've had in mind for a while, and glass is already a nuisance to model in Blender, but modeling glass that has a lot of cavities, if you want to put it that way, holes, essentially, taps are a real nuisance. So that'll be fun when we finally get to it. I came across some figures. I just sort of collect these as I go through journals, and you can see a big collection here. But I came across some figures recently that I thought were just really cool, and many of these are in my collections for things we're going to do with geometry nodes. These types of things are actually surprisingly easy with geometry nodes, and especially with Arendale's toolkit. Things like the Voronoi on solar cells, this is great. This is another one. This is a fantastic example of, using some sort of 3D structure to create a meaningful TOC. And I would guess that this is actually all procedural. I don't think any of this is actual data, but a nice Voronoi texture here for separation, just sort of distorted noise here, and then the little spheres that are all packed together. Fantastic stuff, really easy to do. Many of these things are quite easy to do, and there are some things where you can tell, a lot of effort was put in. You can tell a degree of familiarity or comfort with some of the software, and that grows with time. So obviously we're not being critical of anyone's work here, but these types of things, these sort of cutout Voronois, fantastic stuff. I think this is a really great way of conveying the work that you're doing, and this is relatively straightforward to do, so we're going to work on some things like that. Cutouts, unfortunately, don't have a great workflow in Blender right now. They are almost always based on Booleans, which are really computationally heavy, and even small things like this can really lag down a scene, but that's something that we'll kind of touch on. This is a figure that I like in theory, but I think the UV stitching right here really breaks the illusion a little bit. And if I was going to have done something maybe different here, I would have just added a different material to this rim. So instead of having the obvious distortion of the solar cell, you would have the nice panel on top and then the separate feature. These sort of recurring cutouts are something that I'm going to be touching on in some new tutorials. And one of the things that I want to talk about at some point, outside of an actual tutorial on technical work. So most of my tutorials are obviously very technical breakdowns of how to do a specific effect. This is a cutout, this is a cutout, how are we going to do that? In fact, right here on the pillars, you can see that if you had shaded the Boolean object smooth, then you wouldn't be able to see these gradations and it would look a little bit cleaner perhaps, but that's also an aesthetic choice. But things like this. These are two recent review papers that I saw. I think they came out of Chemical Reviews. This is a very clean figure. This does everything that it needs to do. And as a TOC, I wouldn't change this. I wouldn't substitute this out for something more complex because I really think that this actually does the job. And I like this sort of use of color and simple design because one of the things that's important to remember, even if you're invested in learning 3D, is this idea of simplicity and direct communication. Being straightforward and to the point is going to have a lot of value to the readers of your work and to your efforts as a communicator. So at a glance, I can't necessarily tell what this is about, but it is visually compelling. That's part of the element too, because it's pulling me in. So I want to know what's going on here. It's kind of neat. Usually that's a little bit less of the case with some of these more show pieces. Like this is my Wiley collection. And some of these are fantastic. Some of these are a little bit sillier. My recent work is actually down here. So this is from the Lessard research group where I work right now. And this was a relatively simple thing about designing an OFET material and looking at it to sense for certain molecules. I came into the project sort of towards the end. I do work with the group very actively, kind of in research and management, but I came in at the end to actually make this cover. And there's some fun things that are going on here. So this distortion, this sort of like electrical noise, which you would have kind of, not noise obviously, but this current passage that you would have in a transistor. Originally, I intended for this whole thing to be animated, which is where the ripple effect comes from. And this is actually a light microscopy image of some of the crystal structures that the person who was working on this project did. They collected these images and I said, hey, can I have those for the cover? They look really fantastic. And I essentially took these crystals and just distorted them visually until they looked kind of like pulsing, glowing electricity that I could use between the two electrodes to show that this molecule here is facilitating that transport. One of the things that I often find when I'm personally working on covers is it's not usually the main element that is the challenge. So, something like this is very obvious. What are we looking at here? Oh, we're looking at this setup. We're looking at this right here. We're looking at the fluids and the vials. Very nice work, by the way. Fluid simulation's a nuisance, and this is almost definitely fluid simulation. But for something like this, one of the tricks that I like to use is, how am I going to fill in this background? Well, actually, the background of this whole scene is just this same shot from a different camera angle. So if you look closely, you can see that's the electrode down there. That's the top surface. The ripple is sort of distorting that. So as we go out, you see the reflections, but it doesn't really matter as much. And then you have the main target. So you can see a whole class of advanced materials and similar Wiley covers that do this sort of effect, where they'll pull something from the background, or the background is sort of, I think for a lot of people who are doing this, kind of an afterthought until you sit down to do it and you realize, oh, okay, it's not just about my molecule with the lasers, it's what's going on behind it. And that's part of the reason that some of this procedural work with geometry nodes is so great, because I can make one of these things and then just instance it all over the scene, scatter it randomly, and it looks kind of sensible. It's a reasonable cover decision. A lot of these types of things where you have, proteins and molecules and bilayers and all of these extended structures, these are fantastic to do with things like geometry nodes, where you might want to make a ton of them. And as you get more in depth with Blender and more, knowledgeable about some of this stuff, you'll start to consider some of the more technical details. So I wouldn't make something this geometry heavy and copy it all over the place. I'd do a simpler version, or levels of detail, or camera culling, which Arundel talks about in great detail in some of his work, or their work rather, sorry. And so there is this kind of emphasis on all of these different artistic decisions, but I do want to kind of dive into some of these a little bit more nitty gritty and break them down. I personally feel like I've got a lot of leeway to do that with my own stuff. So if, I made this cover, I can kind of break it down how I want, and using many of the tools that I teach in some of the videos. I feel pretty okay about breaking down some of the other ones. So something like this would be relatively straightforward to break down. I don't think that's really stepping on anyone's toes in terms of the journal copyright or the ability to do that. But it's something that would be fun, and really I'd like to do a little bit more. I've done this one before as well, actually. So this was a former Patreon exclusive. These are real vials, but I've remade this figure using some of the assets that I've created. And so all of this sort of stuff is coming in the not too distant future. Realistically, right now, I wanted to do this carbon nanotube tutorial this weekend in full. And obviously you've just seen me kind of do the hashed out scripted version. But yeah, I don't want to release it before 3.1 is out of beta and is kind of the mainstay release, because there's nothing more frustrating than saying, okay, you have to go to this page that's experimental downloads. And especially when kind of the audience I'm hoping to target is people who they just want to get to the figure, and we'll do it real quick. But that's sort of where I want to leave off. I've been meaning to do this one for a while, because someone actually asked me, how would you make this kind of rust effect? And it's very simple procedural texture, get all of these sort of molecules out, probably a ferrocene of some kind. Obviously that fits the bill of iron and rust, and it's a good decision artistically. But yeah, that's kind of my weekend ramble for the time being. I hope this has been informative or useful or something to that effect. We're building a bit of a community page at the moment. So Brady and I have been discussing this for a while now, but more seriously recently. I think we're going to start having a community Discord for troubleshooting some of these more science-specific Blender things. People can share some of the stuff they're working on. There's some very, very neat opportunities here, and I think building this community out in a larger way is going to be, more than worthwhile. I've seen a lot of people making use of Brady's DNA animations. Those are really, really clever. And so it's nice to have that start to expand and start to see people feel, welcome and to be welcome in that space. So that's sort of what's on the books at the moment. So when I said it was going to be a fun, community-focused February, I think we're really hoping to have that fully launched and, ready to take on new people by the end of the month. And it'll be a place where people can bring their questions, bring their work, bring their figures, all that sort of stuff. And it'll be good. And hopefully that's it. So yeah, obviously if you're watching this on Patreon, or if someone from the Patreon sent you the link, I hope you found this useful or engaging or somewhat informative. And with that, until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.